I wonder how you were going to feel when you find out that I wrote this instead of you. That it was I who got up early to sit in the kitchen and mention with a pen the rain-soaked windows, the ivy, wallpaper, and the goldfish circling in its bowl. Go ahead and turn aside, bite your lip and tear out the page. But listen, it was just a matter of time before one of us happened to notice the unlit candles and the clock humming on the wall. Plus, nothing happened that morning. A song on the radio, a car whistling along the road outside, and I was only thinking about the shakers of salt and pepper that were standing side by side on a placemat. I wondered if they had become friends after all these years, or were they still strangers to one another, like you and I, who managed to be known and unknown to each other at the same time, me at this table with a bowl of pears, you leaning in a doorway somewhere near some blue hydrangeas, reading this.
Welcome to another segment in the Brookdale Community College Visiting Writers Series. My name is Tim Burke. I'm on the faculty in the English department here at Brookdale. And today we welcome former United States Poet Laureate and current New York State Poet Laureate, Billy Collins. Just say a few words about you, and then maybe you'd read us a poem so our audience can see hear what you sound like.
Okay.
Mr. Collins has published 7 volumes of poetry, most recently a book called 9 Horses, published by Random House. He is professor of English at Lehman College, which is part of the City University of New York. He was the Poet Laureate of the United States, most recently 2001 through 2003, and has just recently been appointed New York State Poet Laureate for 2 years, starting this year. He has had fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, among others. He was chosen a literary lion by the New York Public Library, and he has conducted summer workshops in Galway, Ireland at the University College Galway. I'd like to just read 3 little blurbs from one of his book jackets. This is by John Updike. Billy Collins writes lovely poems, lovely in a way almost nobody's since Retke's are. Limpid, gently, and consistently startling, more serious than they seem, they describe all the worlds that are and were, and some others besides. The New York Times said, luring his readers into the poem with humor, Mr. Collins leads them unwittingly into deeper, more serious places, a kind of journey from the familiar or quirky to unexpected territory, sometimes tender, often profound. And finally, from The New Yorker, what Collins does best is turn an apparently simple phrase into a numinous moment, a poet of plenitude, irony, and Augustan grace. Welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you for embarrassing me with all this flattery, but I'll see if I can recover from that.
I'm sure you're used to it. What would you like to read for us to
Well,
start
I thought
off?
I'd read, I'm just going to read a poem now and maybe at the end, but I thought I'd read a poem called Poetry, which is a kind of provisional definition of poetry, you might say. My tactic is basically to distinguish poetry from the lesser forms of written expression, which would be all written forms of written expression. Poetry. Call it a field where the animals who were forgotten by the ark come to graze under the evening clouds, or call it a cistern where the rain that fell before history trickles over a concrete lip. However you see it, this is no place to set up the 3-legged easel of realism or make the reader climb over the many fences of a plot. Let the portly novelist with his noisy typewriter describe the city where Francine was born, how Albert read the paper on the train, how curtains were blowing in the bedroom. Let the playwright with her torn cardigan and a dog curled on the rug move the characters from the wings to the stage. Poetry is no place for that. We have enough to do complaining about the price of tobacco, passing the dripping ladle, and singing songs to a bird in a cage. We are busy doing nothing, and all we need for that is an afternoon, a rowboat under a blue sky, and maybe a man fishing from a stone bridge. or better still, nobody on that bridge at all.
Why would it be better not to have someone on the bridge?
That's a very good question. I suppose just to not to complicate it with psychology, I mean, the novel and drama has to be psychologically pertinent, or has to be plugged into psychological realities, whereas poetry, it's one of the many freedoms of poetry that doesn't really need to have a convincingly or credible psychological dimension. But I think the more interesting thing is that in poetry you can create a fisherman standing on this bridge and then just obliterate him in the next line. And you can't do that in a novel. So it's sort of like Etch-a-Sketch, you just make him go away. So he existed for one line and now he's gone.
Do you agree with the idea that out of quarrels with ourselves we make poetry?
Well, out of daydreaming with ourselves, I don't know if it's so much an argument, but it's I think it's taking something that's very private, and I don't really mean emotionally private, but the kind of private places where the imagination travels and daydreaming, because I think a lot of poetry arises out of we learn to daydream as children. I mean, there is this sort of dimension of child reverie that we fall into, and especially when we go off to hiding places. You know, Gaston Bachelard talks about this. We make forts out of sofa cushions and we hide under the stairs, and wherever our hiding place is, that's where the imagination begins to work. And I think a lot of artists or writers are simply people who haven't lost touch with that sequestered, daydreaming child.
I remember in one of your poems, I think it's called The Past, actually, you talk about these little memories that are insignificant to most people, but they carry as much weight as any others for you personally as a poet. And you say that they... could we look at that poem for a second?
I'm not sure where it is, actually.
I know where it is.
I think it's the... I don't know, it might be the sense that there's voluntary memory where you'd say, what did I do last week? And then there's unbidden memories that just pop up in your head. And some of those memories seem to be moments of complete insignificance, but they're as stuck in your mind as your wedding day or, the day you graduated from a school.
What I was thinking about was, you say, but as you remember them, it's like reading a poem that begins by carrying us zombie-like down basement stairs as if to leave us in the dark, feeling the air for a light chord. But then a little metaphor begins to grow with such detail that it becomes a place, a lake, for instance, etc. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the first time that happened for you, that metaphor appeared in yourself as a writer?
I remember, I have one early memory of driving with my parents in the back of my parents' car. I was an only child, so I had the back seat to myself, which was a luxury, I suppose. And we were driving up the East Side Highway, and there was a sailboat which was tacking up the East River. And I'm not sure, in retrospect, I could say I was struck with the contrast between the natural and the architectural or whatever, but I don't know why. But I asked my mother for something to write on. And I don't know what I write, but I do remember that I saw something and I had a literary reaction to it. It was my first act of literature. And then maybe 30 years later I had a book published, but I'm not sure what happened in the intervening time.
What was your first success as a poet?
Well, success is measured very relatively. I remember in the 70s, they used to publish little poems in the back of Rolling Stone magazine, and I had a lot of little poems published back there. And obviously it wasn't a literary magazine, but it had a huge circulation, and it was cool to have a poem in there. And they paid $35. Now, I think a pack of cigarettes cost like 80 cents back then, so you could buy a lot of cigarettes.
How old were you at that time?
I was in my 20s.
Uh-huh. Okay. Were you doing creative things as a kid, doing art or writing a lot?
Yeah, I was drawing, and I spent a lot of time doing this daydreaming and not, I was keeping little journals and things like that. I mean, I have the sense that poetry really arises out of this early recording that some of us do as children or as young adults. I don't think people keep diaries anymore, but when I was young, girls essentially kept diaries because it was thought that girls in early adolescence went to their rooms and closed the door and had feelings, whereas boys were out beating each other up. And the diary was a place to record these feelings. And the diary, remember, had a lock on it. Mm-hmm. There was a good reason for that. And it had, the lock was in the shape of a heart, and there was a good reason for that. And my sense is that poetry is a way of expressing this inner life without fear of embarrassment or mortification. And the reason is that poetry has form. Poetry is shaped. It gives musical and rhythmic pleasure, whereas reading someone's diary gives you no pleasure except the guilty pleasure of discovering someone's secrets.
I remember in one of your poems, I think it talks about turning 10. Mm-hmm. And you say people forget what that was like because they forget all the prior years as well. And you go all the way back to the first year, I think, turning 1. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, how can he remember?
Oh, yeah. I mean, all I said about 1 was that it was probably, had a beautiful simplicity about it to be 1. And then when you turned 2, everything got a little complicated. But there are lots of poems about on turning 40 and on turning 50 and whatnot. So I thought I'd write this poem called On Turning 10. The beginning of it all. On turning 10. The whole idea of it makes me feel like I'm coming down with something. Something worse than any stomach ache or the headaches I get from reading in bad light. A kind of measles of the spirit, a mumps of the psyche, disfiguring chickenpox of the soul. You tell me it is too early to be looking back, but that is because you have forgotten the beautiful simplicity of being 1 and the perfect complexity introduced by 2. But I can lie on my bed and remember every digit. At 4, I was an Arabian wizard. I could make myself invisible by drinking a glass of milk a certain way. At 7, I was a soldier. At 9, a prince. But now I am mostly at the window, watching the late afternoon light. Back then, it never fell so solemnly against the side of my treehouse, and my bicycle never leaned against the garage as it does today, all the dark blue speed drained out of it. This is the beginning of sadness, I say to myself, as I walk through the universe in my sneakers. It is time to say goodbye to my imaginary friends, time to turn the first big number. It seems only yesterday I used to believe there was nothing under my skin but light. If you cut me, I would shine. But now, when I fall upon the sidewalks of life, I skin my knees. I bleed. Thank you.
So my question is, do you lie in your poems?
Well, poetry, I mean, I lie about a lot of little things. I mean, there are a lot of white lies in the poems. One example would be, I have a lot of dogs in my poems. I'm just a real dog lover. But for a while there, I was between dogs. I didn't have a dog. But I'd be writing a poem, and if I felt it needed a dog, I would just bring a dog in and for a couple of stanzas, and the dog would leave. But this was just a poetry dog I had. Here's a poem about a dog. The way the dog trots out the front door every morning without a hat or an umbrella, without any money or the keys to her doghouse, never fails to fill the saucer of my heart with milky admiration. Who provides a finer example of a life without encumbrance? Thoreau, in his curtainless hut, with a single plate, a single spoon? Gandhi, with his staff and his knotted diapers? Off she goes into the material world with nothing but her brown coat and her modest blue collar, following only her wet nose, the twin portals of her steady breathing, followed only by the plume of her tail. If only she did not shove the cat aside every morning and eat all his food. What a model of self-containment she would be. What a paragon of earthly detachment. If only she were not so eager for a rub behind the ears, so acrobatic in her welcomes. If only I were not her God. The bigger lie of poetry, and lie is unfortunately a bad word, but if you're a novelist, you have to make up dozens of characters, hundreds of characters. If you're a poet, you really just have to make up one character, and that is the voice that accommodates your need to express yourself. So what Emily Dickinson did, or Walt Whitman, basically they invented a character, and we recognize that voice when we hear it. So in that sense, it's all lies, because it's all spoken not by me, but by this character who I would say is a much improved version of myself, a much kind of edited, cleaned up version of myself.
Did you ever feel tempted to give that person a name other than your own name, like Berryman did?
No, because I think, I don't know, I mean, I did have an imaginary friend as a child whose name was Dan. This has never come out, I don't think, but who cares? But I think of this person as maybe incorporating that kind of other self. That's this kind of a better version. The person in the poetry is not the person that my wife married, and she'll be quick to tell you that.
You also have mice in your poems occasionally, and you seem to have a very sympathetic nature that I wanted to ask you about. Where's that come from?
My new book is called 9 Horses, and a friend of mine said it should have been called 9 Mice, because there are so many mice there. Well, I don't know, I think it's basic to poetry that you have a kind of, as Keats put it, a kind of negative capability, a way of empathizing with others. Mm-hmm. Where the mouse stuff comes from, it probably is a combination of watching cartoons as a child, and back of all poems is another poem. I wondered about you when you told me never to leave a box of wooden strike anywhere matches just lying around the house, because the mice might get into them and start a fire. But your face was absolutely straight when you twisted the lid down on the round tin where the matches, you said, are always stowed. Who could sleep that night? Who could whisk away the thought of the one unlikely mouse padding along a cold water pipe behind the floral wallpaper, gripping a single wooden match between the needles of his teeth? Who could not see him rounding a corner, the blue tip scratching against a rough-hewn beam, the sudden flare, and the creature, for one bright, shining moment, suddenly thrust ahead of his time, now a fire starter, now a torchbearer in a forgotten ritual, little brown druid illuminating some ancient night? Who could fail to notice, lit up in the blazing insulation, the tiny looks of wonderment on the faces of his fellow mice, one-time inhabitants of what once was your house in the country?
Get a job.
Look, it's a giraffe!
I don't see it.
The less art kids get, the more it shows. Are yours getting enough? Art. Ask for more. AmericansForTheArts.org.
You're watching Brookdale Television.
Welcome back to the Brookdale Writers Series. My name's Tim Burke, and we're speaking today with Poet Laureate Billy Collins. Welcome again.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask you next about anyone who might have encouraged you as a poet or as a writer early in your career.
Well, obviously, I mean, some teachers did. I think, frankly, I got probably more inspiration from people who discouraged me, who dismissed my interest in poetry as a kind of adolescent symptom, or something that wouldn't last, because I reacted in a way that I wanted to prove them wrong. So that really, discouragement really got me going. Probably discouragement is underrated as an educational device, I think. But later, I did we get to whatever bit of success we do through the hand grasps of others. And one of the big helping hands for me was the poet Miller Williams, who you might remember did the Clinton's second inaugural poem, and he's a native son. He's from Arkansas, and he's also, unfortunately for him, perhaps now known as the father of the singer Lucinda Williams. But I sent him a manuscript of poems, and this was before I had a real book, and he sent the poems back. He was the editor at the University of Arkansas Press, very good university press. He sent the poems back, about 40 of them, and he put a paperclip around about 15 of them, and a little note that just said, "You have 15 really good poems here," indicated by the paperclip. And if you can write more poems like as good as those, I'll publish your book.
Uh-huh.
Well, I needed someone to tell me that. I needed someone to tell me that I had something going for myself, but I also needed someone to tell me I couldn't get away with the things I was trying to get away with. So I took the poems, the loose poems, and I threw them out, and I kept the 14 poems. And for the next year or so, I knew what he meant. I can't quite explain it right now, but I could see that those poems that he clipped were different from the others, and that was the direction I should go in. So I spent the next year or more writing poems, trying to get up to that standard, and eventually he did publish my book. And I had never took an MFA degree. I've never really taken a workshop, but that paperclip was worth a Master's of Fine Arts degree.
Well, I have to ask, what was it about those 14? You recognized it yourself when he isolated them from the others.
Well, I think they were a bit fuller. They were less. I think the ones that we cast aside were kind of superficially jokey. They were a little smarty pants, a little too clever for your own good kind of thing, and did not have much heart in them. It was more jokey and clever. And the 14 had, it's hard to say, but had some sort of tenderness in them.
And did that result in the apple that astonished Paris?
Yeah, I got to work, and it was like someone had given me an assignment, and I just wrote for a year or so or more to please this guy I'd never met from Arkansas, and the result was my first real book.
How did you happen to send them to him?
A friend of mine, excuse me, Ron Kirchie, had a book published there, and I was able to drop his name in the first paragraph, and that seemed like a good enough. I wasn't very well connected then, so.
On another subject, there's a lot of music and jazz in your imagery and apparently in your life. Were you an early listener to jazz? I think in one of your poems you mentioned 1957 or something. Something happened with jazz.
Well, that was my favorite year for jazz. Most of the jazz I listened to was recorded from about 1947 to 1963. I've got a pretty definite sense of the jazz I like, which is basically bebop and hard bop. But I've been listening to jazz ever since I was about 13 or 14, when I heard, just by accident, Benny Goodman's, I think it's the 1938 Carnegie Hall concert. I heard some hipsters playing this at a hotel when I was about 14, and I was hooked for life. And so I studied jazz piano a little bit. I'm not very good at all, but I can play a little bit, and it's something else to write about. It's another subject matter. I don't think there are too many connections between jazz and poetry. One kind of poetry I have little stomach for is poetry that tries to sound jazzy, or tries to sound like poems that look like they have sunglasses on all the time. They're trying to be either too cool, or they're trying to syncopate the way jazz does. And it would be much easier just to put on a CD rather than listen to syncopated poetry.
Do you have jazz playing when you write?
I do, but I also have jazz playing when I'm buttering the toast and brushing the dog and doing all sorts of other things. So I don't think of it as sort of inspirational music. I mean, jazz is improvisation, basically, and writing, in writing you try to sound improvised, but it's not improvised. A simple, a cute way to sum that up is to say that there's no eraser on a saxophone. You know, you can't go back and erase a phrase of music if you're improvising, but you can with poetry. And that's where the analogy between poetry and jazz, I think, breaks down completely. At any rate, Johnny Hartman, a singer of jazz ballads, is mentioned, and the poem is called Nightclub. You are so beautiful, and I am a fool to be in love with you, is a theme that keeps coming up in songs and poems. There seems to be no room for variation. I have never heard anyone sing, I am so beautiful, and you are a fool to be in love with me, even though this notion has surely crossed the minds of women and men alike. You are so beautiful, too bad you're a fool is another one you don't hear. Or, you are a fool to consider me beautiful. That one you will never hear, guaranteed. For no particular reason, this afternoon, I am listening to Johnny Hartman, whose dark voice can curl around the concepts of love, beauty, and foolishness like no one else's can. It feels like smoke curling up from a cigarette someone left burning on a baby grand piano around 3 o'clock in the morning, smoke that billows up into the bright lights, while out there in the darkness, some of the beautiful fools have gathered around little tables to listen, some with their eyes closed, others leaning forward into the music as if it were holding them up, or just twirling the loose ice in a glass, slipping by degrees into a rhythmic dream. Yes, there is all this foolish beauty born beyond midnight that has no desire to go home, especially now when everyone in the room is watching the large man with the tenor sax that hangs from his neck like a golden fish. He moves forward to the edge of the stage and hands the instrument down to me and nods that I should play. So I put the mouthpiece to my lips and blow into it with all my living breath. We are all so foolish. My long bebop solo begins by saying, so damn foolish, we have become beautiful without even knowing it.
I have this picture of you padding around in some bright dining room sort of place with big windows and encyclopedia on the floor and another dictionary over here or something, and tapping out a few words at a time. I think you mentioned that once. It's the best way to do it. Is that accurate?
Well, it's partly accurate. I mean, as I said, I invented this character, and the character is not just a way of speaking, you know, an idiolect, a sound of a voice, but he is a person of certain interest and mannerisms. This character I invented, this nameless person who was like me but not me, clearly doesn't have a job. He has lots of time on his hands, tends to look out the window a lot, and a kind of professional daydreamer. But I do live in an old house, and like most writers, there's an encyclopedia. I have an encyclopedia and a dictionary nearby, and I enjoy those times when you can just look at water or listen to birdsong, which is really part of the poet's job description.
How do you know when there's a poem ready to be written?
Well, I think there are a lot of false starts. A poem can start anywhere with a line you read in a magazine, or a bit of conversation you overhear, or something you see, and you get a sense maybe there's something there. I don't know what tells you that. It's a little like those metal detectors that start beeping. And then I think the next step is to recognize whether this idea or for the poem has momentum at all, whether it has any possibilities. And usually I can tell pretty quickly if the beginning of the poem is going to give birth to something more, or whether it's just a false start, in which case I just pitch it and wait for the next.
Do you sometimes have an
Spasm.
image? I'm sorry. I thought you were spasm.
Just looking for a word there.
Is there an image that comes to mind sometimes and it ends up being the last image in the poem? Do you know you're going to end on that thought or description or something? Or?
I think I'll admit to having done that maybe 2 or 3 times, but I would agree with Frost that that's a form of cheating. That if you know the ending first, and then the poem is basically backfilling. You know, it's like it would be like coming up with a punchline for a joke and then fabricating a joke that would lead up to that punchline. The ending should, arise organically out of the progress of the poem, and not be something that is really, cart before the horse.
Do you tinker with them later? Go back and change them?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's tinkering and worrying and and changing and trying to make it better, but
Years later, after it's been published even?
occasionally little things, but usually the beginning, middle, and end of the poem is done pretty much in one rush, in one sitting, and the tinkering, the revisions are almost entirely rhythmic and changing rhythm and music in the poem, trying
Almost
to make it sound better.
Not part of the process or the feeling that led to
No,
the...
not. I don't make these big structural changes and say, well, I feel different about that now.
Yeah.
I mean, Wordsworth did that with the Prelude. He wrote it in, 1805 was the first edition, and he tinkered with it for 45 years and ruined it in some way.
Is there a poem you haven't been able to write yet, but you expect to sooner or later?
Well, just the next one. Yeah.
Whatever comes along.
Yeah, I don't have a list of I should write about this and that. One thing you experience when you're a poet is that people come up to you and say, "Oh, you're going to write a poem about this," or "Oh, there's a poem for you to write about." They are wrong 100% of the time. I don't know why, but I think it's just the way it proceeds. I never think, "Oh, there's a good idea for a poem." A poem, I think, arises more out of language and some kind of unconscious impulse than like a checklist of things to write about. That would be more, I think, like I can see the life of an essayist being, I want to write about freedom of speech, I want to write about, but...
When people say that to you, are you tempted to say, you write it?
Yeah, I've said worse than that.
Okay. Can you think of a poem, or maybe even find one, where you labored over 2 competing words, where you just couldn't, and then you found the word, kind of?
That happens a lot. I mean, getting down to that level of language where you're just worried about what, in a series of 3 things, should this come second or first, or whether it's this word or that word. I mean, it's a little like going to the optometrist or the
Oculist.
oculist, and he says, better like this, better like that, better like this, better like that. This poem got started when a word just popped into my day, and the word is the title of the poem, and it's called The Lanyard. The other day, as I was ricocheting slowly off the blue walls of this room, bouncing from typewriter to piano, from bookshelf to an envelope lying on the floor, I found myself in the L section of the dictionary, where my eyes fell upon the word lanyard. No cookie nibbled by a French novelist could send one more suddenly into the past, a past where I sat at a workbench at a camp by a deep Adirondack lake, learning how to braid thin plastic strips into a lanyard, a gift for my mother. I had never seen anyone use a lanyard or wear one if that's what you did with them. But that did not keep me from crossing strand over strand again and again until I had made a boxy red and white lanyard for my mother. She gave me life and milk from her breasts, and I gave her a lanyard. She She nursed me in many a sick room, lifted teaspoons of medicine to my lips, set cold face cloths on my forehead, then led me out into the airy light and taught me to walk and swim, and I in turn presented her with a lanyard. Here are thousands of meals, she said, and here is clothing and a good education, and here is your lanyard, I replied, which I made with a little help from a counselor. Here is a breathing body and a beating heart, strong legs, bones, and teeth, and 2 clear eyes to read the world, she whispered. And here, I said, is the lanyard I made at camp. And here, I wish to say to her now, is a smaller gift, not the archaic truth that you can never repay your mother, but the rueful admission that when she took the 2-tone lanyard from my hands, I was as sure as a boy could be that this useless, worthless thing I wove out of boredom would be enough to make us even. I know you know at that age there are only a few options. You can make a pot holder is one, and then there's if you're at like a fancy camp, you can make a ceramic cup of some kind, but you don't have the brains to put a handle on it, so it's also a thing that your mother doesn't quite know what to do with. One mother, after hearing that poem, told me that these cups without handles are known among mothers as lanyard holders. It's actually where the lanyard is kept. And then there's the thesaurus, which is a dangerous work of reference if consulted too early. But in a bind, I mean, if you need a word to convey chilliness or coldness or frigidity or something, and there might be a word you're just not thinking of that the thesaurus might provide. But it's that book, which is really hard to pronounce, is a kind of court of last appeal for a writer.
Do you warn students not to run off to the thesaurus?
Oh, absolutely, because what students tend to do is choose the biggest word they can find that they've never heard of before, and their use of the thesaurus is based on the false notion that there is such a thing as a synonym, because a thesaurus is a dictionary of synonyms. But any writer will tell you that there is no such thing as a synonym, that house and home aren't obviously not the same. Home is warm and house is cool.
One of your poems talks about that, I think, where words they gather together or something.
Yeah, it's a sort of a sense of, well, I describe the thesaurus as it sounds like a prehistoric beast, you know, like a brontosaurus, I guess, that gets up on its hind legs and starts spouting vocabulary.
I recall you said you prefer late afternoon to write. I just wanted to ask again, do you have any other habits that might be interesting to people?
Well, that was a lie. That was a good example.
Okay.
Another example of a lie. I like to write in the morning because I think early on, before you start using public language and hearing public language, you are more susceptible and you're closer to the dream state. Not that I would inflict my dreams on anybody, but you're a little looser and more flexible. So writing early in the morning is the best time for me.
Keep a dream journal by your bed by any chance?
No, because I did that for a while, but I would when I read them back, I could not get the feeling of the dream. You know, every dream has an emotion to it. It's that you can't quite describe, and you can write down the narrative that you're in a taxi and then you ran into Joan of Arc and then it started raining basketballs or whatever, because when we fall asleep we all turn into these little surrealists, but you could never quite get that emotion that you have. So writing a dream journal seemed pointless to me.
How do you get students to move beyond cliche when they write? Those who are tempted to use cliché.
You try to point out what is a cliche. I mean, some of them, some students don't recognize what are cliches. I mean, things become cliches, but they were originally brilliant, weren't they? I mean,
That's why they're cliche.
yeah. I mean, the first one, yeah, the first person to use the lion as an image of courage was probably a stroke of genius. But now it's dead. I think students or young poets, if they're going to go anywhere with poetry or writing in any way, have to have a contempt for cliche, because cliche means that it's store-bought, it's off-the-rack language, it's used language, and the difficulty with writing is that words have precedence. You know, if you take a piece of marble and make a sculpture out of it, or you paint something, the paint doesn't. You can't look the paint up in a dictionary, but all these words that we use come with a history and etymology and centuries of usage and misusage. So how do you take that soiled monster, the language, and produce something that's fresh?
That's the trick.
That's the trick, yeah. Like Pound said, make it new. Somehow resuscitate this sloppy language and make it breathe in a new way. So I took the first two lines of his poem, a love poem, which he basically just is a circus of comparisons, and out of professional courtesy, I rewrote the poem for him. So the two lines of his poem are the same as the first two lines of mine, and the quote from him is, "You are the bread," he says to the beloved, "you are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine. You are the bread and the knife, the crystal goblet and the wine. You are the dew on the morning grass and the burning wheel of the sun. You are the white apron of the baker and the marsh bird suddenly in flight. However, you are not the wind in the orchard, the plums on the counter, or the house of cards, and you are certainly not pine-scented air. There is no way you are the pine-scented air. It is possible that you are the fish under the bridge, maybe even the pigeon on the general's head, but you are not even close to being the field of cornflowers at dusk. And a quick look in the mirror will show that you are neither the boots in the corner nor the boat asleep in its boathouse. It might interest you to know, speaking of the plentiful imagery of the world, that I am the sound of rain on the roof. I also happen to be the shooting star, the evening paper blowing down an alley, and the basket of chestnuts on the kitchen table. I am also the moon in the trees and the blind woman's teacup. But don't worry, I am not the bread and the knife. You are still the bread and the knife. You will always be the bread and the knife, not to mention the crystal goblet and somehow the wine.
You're watching Brookdale Television.
Plastic ones last longer.
Pork bellies close steady due to speculation that demand for bacon-related products.
Read me this one, Daddy.
Okay, honey. The less art kids get, the more it shows. Are yours getting enough? Art. Ask for more. AmericansForTheArts.org.
Welcome back to the Visiting Writers Series here at Brookdale. My name's Tim Burke, and I'm speaking today with Poet Laureate Billy Collins. Welcome back again.
Thanks.
Thank you. Would you tell us a little about what the Poet Laureate does?
He answers that question a lot, for one thing.
He or she?
He or she. Well, yeah, he or she. I was going to say, I say he because there's been no British female poet laureate in 350 years, but maybe they'll change that. Well, there's a short checklist of duties. I mean, the main thing that people might not know about it, because it's kind of a nebulous title, is that the poet laureate is appointed by the Librarian of Congress. His name now is James Billington, who's a Russian scholar. And you're really, you're not so much, you don't have anything to do with the administration or the White House. You are really an employee of the Library of Congress. And how the librarian decides is a mystery to me. There is no committee that gets together and votes. It's a completely autocratic, one-person decision. The news is received over the telephone, out of the blue. There's no short list. You don't know that you're being considered, so it just happens. It's a good reason to have a telephone, actually. There's a very short list of duties. The Poet Laureate gives a reading at the Library of Congress and a lecture every year of the appointment. And you also are expected to run a reading series there to invite other poets and introduce them. And that's about it. You're given some money to give to younger poets, and you could do all of that very easily and just sit around on your laurels, so to speak. However, it offers these enormous opportunities to be kind of an activist for poetry, and many of my recent predecessors, at least, have come up with national initiatives that involve poetry. This is a fairly new development. Robert Penn Warren, during one of his terms as Poet Laureate, basically spent the time writing All the King's Men. That's a good thing to do with your time. But what I did was basically started this program called Poetry 180. It was meant to stand for the 180 days of the school year, and it was posted on the internet, 180 contemporary good poems. And I was encouraging high schools to have one of the poems read every day, not in classrooms, but as part of the public announcements, so that poetry would be a little more of a part of everyday life than a subject that came between trigonometry and European history.
And how did that work out?
It worked out very well. I mean, quite frankly, when I put up the website and got the 180 poems together and had the site designed, I thought secretly, well, if no one ever looks at it, I mean, I did it, right? So I could, but in fact, you can measure the amount of attention a site gets, and it does get about 1 million or so hits a month, and there's a guest book, and hundreds of high schools are participating. And Random House put out a book called Poetry 180, and we're now planning a second group of 180 poems.
Do you think that helped people feel more at ease with poetry as part of, or recognize that it can be a valuable part of one's life?
Well, I think so. I think all of these poems were meant as little bits of bait to try to lure people into the larger house of poetry. Many people lose touch with poetry, largely, I think, because of a combination of miseducation, meaning that the emphasis is almost entirely on analysis and explication. So we have to find out what the poem means, or worse, we have to find out what the poet was trying to say. I mean, it's a strange question. I mean, the poet was trying to say something implies that he or she failed to say it, but that we, the class of English 102 here at this high school, will figure out what he was trying to say. And there's that kind of miseducation, and also the poetry you tend to get in school is often trailing behind the times, 50, 100, or 300 years. And all the poems in the Poetry 180 book are extremely contemporary. So the idea was to bring people up to date and let them hear the way poetry sounds right now. And it's a way of, showing people what the chorus of voices sounds like in contemporary American poetry. So this poem was just one way to configure this mass of students. And it's called Schoolsville. Glancing over my shoulder at the past, I realize the number of students I have taught is enough to populate a small town. I can see it nestled in a paper landscape, chalk dust flurrying down in winter, nights dark as a blackboard. The population ages but never graduates. On hot afternoons, they sweat the final in the park, and when it's cold, they shiver around stoves reading disorganized essays out loud. A bell rings on the hour, and everybody zigzags into the streets with their books. I forgot all their last names first and their first names last, in alphabetical order. But the boy who always had his hand up is an alderman and owns the haberdashery. The girl who signed her papers in lipstick leans against the drugstore, smoking, brushing her hair like a machine. Their grades are sewn into their clothes like references to Hawthorne. The A's stroll along with other A's. The D's honk whenever they pass another D. All the creative writing students recline on the courthouse lawn and play the lute. Wherever they go, they form a big circle. Needless to say, I am the mayor. I live in the white colonial at Maple and Main. I rarely leave the house. The car deflates in the driveway. Vines twirl around the porch swing. Once in a while, a student knocks on the door with a term paper 15 years late, or a question about Yeats or double spacing, and sometimes one will appear in a window pane to watch me lecturing the wallpaper, quizzing the chandelier, reprimanding the air.
Whose poems do you read?
Well, every poet is kind of just a bunch of influences put together with duct tape, and I read a range of poets. I go back and I read the Romantic poets. I read Coleridge a lot. I read a lot of Chinese poetry. I could tick off, 20 or so contemporary poets that I read out of jealousy or that inspire me to write more. The more of your life you devote to reading, the more you'll forget. It's like the mind is sort of a limited bookshelf, and so every time I read a new book, I feel that the book on the end is falling off, into an abyss. There's only so much room there. At any rate, so it's about different kinds of forgetting, forgetfulness. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. It is as if one by one the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago, you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye, and you watched the quadratic equation pack its bag. And even now, as you memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away. A state flower, perhaps. The address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay. Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue, not even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It has floated away down a dark, mythological river whose name begins with an L, as far as you can recall, well on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have forgotten even how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart.
Are you ready to do a new book yourself soon?
Probably at the end of this year. I don't go thematically. I just wait until I think I have enough poems that will be good enough to turn into a book, and I rake them into a pile and see what's there. But probably by the end of 2004.
Do you rake them into several piles? Is that how the sections happen?
Well, what I do is, and it's odd, the theme of the book is basically me, because I wrote them all. So I take all the poems and I go to the biggest room in the house and I put all the poems out on the floor individually. So I spread them out in any old order, face up. I might add, it's not like, and I get a dart and it's face up. And then I wander around a lot and I look at a poem. Suddenly, it's like putting playing cards together, finding matching cards. This poem over here will want to be with this poem. So I'll pick it up and put it next to that poem. And this one might want to be with that one. I might decide later, whoops, he doesn't want to be with this group. It's almost like as if all these poems walked into a party and they would form little groups of familiarity and collegiality. I'm not sure why they want to be with each other, and I couldn't look over and tell you, well, this is the death pile and this is the nature pile or whatever, but so it's by a kind of Ouija board process of intuition that they form little piles.
Well, I'd like to ask you to end our conversation by reading one more poem. Would you read us something?
Sure, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Now that we're saying our formalities, I will end with it's a very short poem.
Before you do that, I think I'll sign off and tell our audience that we appreciate your being with us and we hope it was interesting for you, and we hope you'll come back and join us for our next segment of the Visiting Writers series here at Brookdale.
The dead are always looking down on us, they say. While we are putting on our shoes or making a sandwich, they are looking down through the glass-bottom boats of heaven as they row themselves slowly through eternity. They watch the tops of our heads moving below on earth, and when we lie down in a field or on a couch, drugged perhaps by the hum of a warm afternoon, they think we are looking back at them, which makes them lift their oars and fall silent and wait, like parents, for us to close our eyes. This, according to the voice on the radio, the host of a classical music program, no less, this is the birthday of Vivaldi. He would be 325 years old today, quite bent over, I would imagine, and not able to see much through his watery eyes. Surely he would be deaf by now, the clothes flaking off him, hair pitiably sparse. But we would throw a party for him anyway, a surprise party where everyone would hide behind the furniture to listen for the tap of his cane on the pavement and the sound of his dry, persistent cough.